We're going to be talking about market imperfections, and we have started talking about this a week ago or more. Market imperfection is any sort of deviation away from the standard assumption of perfect competition. Last week, we introduced the idea that maybe in the adjustment to a change in policy or a change in trade, that a country might be affected by unemployment in a particular import-competing market. We looked at the effect of a decrease in the international price for a particular good that would cause a surge of imports to come into the country. And we were mimicking, if you will, in a very simple context, what might transpire in order to induce a reaction with the safeguards law that's available to the United States and to other WTO member countries. That law is initiated whenever there's a surge of imports that suddenly upsets or has some impact on an import-competing industry or a set of firms. We're able to show in that case that the surge of imports would indeed be detrimental to the import-competing industry. Output would go down, unemployment perhaps, or loss of workers would go up certainly. Profitability or producer surplus would go down. It would harm the industry without question. It would also benefit consumers, and in a perfectly competitive market, the benefits to consumers are quite likely to outweigh the losses to the individual producing firms. So that if we were in a perfectly competitive setting, we might just want to accept that surge of imports, allow more imports to flow in, and say, it's a good day. It's good that we've got this taking place. But if we change the assumption, and in particular, if we incorporate an imperfection like unemployment into the mix, well, then the story changes a little bit, and it can change in a completely opposite way. It can change so that the surge of imports might actually make the country worse off because it causes this unemployment on the other side. And that unemployment might be bad enough to outweigh the benefits that are accruing to the consumers in total. And if that's true, it might indeed be possible to improve welfare for the country by protecting that market temporarily, raising up the tariff, like with a safeguards action, and taking away some of those benefits from consumers, but benefiting the firm and eliminating the unemployment. And it's conceivable, though not a guarantee, that you could actually improve the national welfare of a country by doing that. Now, that can be done in a small country context, and it demonstrates that there's a situation where protectionism could actually be better for the country than not protecting the market. Now, the reason for it turns out to be because there is this imperfection, because there is the problem associated with unemployment. In a perfectly competitive model, those workers who lose their jobs in the contracting industry, those workers are just going to find a job somewhere else immediately, and we don't really worry about their fate because markets are perfect and workers always get jobs. Now that's a little bit of a silly assumption. And so when we relax that silly assumption and introduce something a little bit more realistic, we suddenly come up with a little bit more ambiguity about what's best to do. And we develop a rationale for intervention by government. Now, there's a lot more to the story, though, and I'm just going to walk through that story again really quickly, because then we're going to duplicate that story again with respect to another situation in trade markets and talk about the infant industry argument in just a second. But the story is more complicated than just protection can benefit us, because it's possible, and gets a little bit beyond our technical capabilities in this class, because it involves comparing policies that we haven't had enough chance to develop and look at or analyze. So economists have long looked at comparisons between domestic policy interventions and trade policy interventions to correct for a particular problem in a market. And when we put a tariff in place because of a surge of imports, we're introducing a trade policy to try to solve a particular problem. The appropriate domestic policy that we can compare it to, though, turns out to be a production subsidy. And that's something we didn't analyze and didn't work through the detailed effects of here. So just take my word for it that if we did introduce a production subsidy to try to increase production of those firms back up to their original level when the surge occurred, that we could eliminate the unemployment with that policy as well. And if we do a welfare comparison between a trade policy like a tariff and a production subsidy to correct for the same unemployment problem in that circumstance, we find that the production subsidy does better. It actually improves or eliminates the unemployment at a lower cost to the economy and we get a more efficient outcome, if you will, by using the production subsidy instead of the trade policy. And this now opens up kind of a can of worms, if you will, because now we can indeed argue that maybe trade policy is a good thing, but we can also argue against trade policy and say, if we want to correct for this problem, we ought to do it in another way instead. And that means using a domestic policy like a production subsidy instead of using a trade policy. Now today I'm going to talk a little bit more about another intervention where trade policy might be appropriate, it could work, but where also it's going to turn out a domestic policy like a production subsidy could do even better. And there's lots of instances like that in the trade literature where we look at policies and say, could trade policy work in this situation? We say, yes, it can. Trade policy can raise welfare here, it can raise welfare there, it can raise welfare because there's all sorts of situations where it can raise welfare for a country. But when we ask that next question, is it the best way to improve welfare in the circumstance involved? The answer is usually no. There's usually another way to get at the problem more directly, and that turns out to be the key. The best policy option always turns out to be the intervention that gets at the imperfection in the market as directly as possible. And that leads us to a way of thinking about problems in international trade. It allows us to think about things like, what exactly is the imperfection? How does this real-world situation deviate from the assumptions we make in a perfectly competitive model? And if we can identify those deviations carefully, then we can design better policies to intervene in the least costly or most efficient way to try to correct for that particular problem. Now, with respect to the unemployment problem, I suggested to you at the end of class last time that actually even the production subsidy may not be the very best policy to pursue. And that's because the production subsidy doesn't really get at the heart of the matter. Yes, it eliminates the unemployment, but it eliminates it by pushing the workers or giving them jobs back in their original industry. And that turns out not to be the best thing to do because our guide is really what should happen in a perfectly competitive world to get us to the most efficient outcome. In that perfectly competitive world, the workers do lose their jobs, but they quickly get jobs in other industries. And that is really how we want to move towards a more efficient economy, because getting jobs in other industries means getting jobs in industries where we have a comparative advantage now relative to yesterday when the surge hadn't occurred. So we'd like to be able to figure out policies that are going to allow for an adjustment of workers from contracting sectors from which we no longer have a comparative advantage. And things are changing all the time. So while we might be best at producing something today, next year or 5 years from now, we may not be the best source of production for a particular item. And we would like to be able to move our workforce out of industries where we're less efficient in and towards industries where we're more efficient. And that would be an even more efficient way of going. So somehow figuring out how to motivate that particular adjustment process seems to be most ideal in terms of trying to solve for the unemployment problem here. Now, I will point out that in the last week or so, listening to the new administration coming in, it seems like they have a completely opposite view of this. Because I think I heard Trump talking about how it's absolutely ridiculous to think that we're going to let workers leave their jobs and retrain them and get them trained up for other industries. And so his approach seems to be, well, we just need to be able to protect them and keep their jobs where they are. And while that can be a perfectly reasonable short-term scenario, trade theory and economics would kind of suggest that that's not really the best thing in the longer term. Okay, so that's, again, a recap of the story we went through on Wednesday of last week. Now let's turn our attention to another market imperfection, the case of infant industries. I'm going to wait a little bit before I get into the heart of the matter, like what is the imperfection that's actually going on here. And just tell you a little bit about what the basic idea of the infant industry story is. It's a pretty simple one, and you've probably heard of it before. The idea applies best perhaps to developing countries in a world where there are both developed nations and developing nations. The developing nations around the world often argue that they can't really effectively compete in international markets. And their argument is usually based on the notion that the productivity in their industries are generally much, much lower than the productivity in the advanced or developed countries around the world. So, for example, you take a small developing country somewhere in the world and say, hey, maybe you should produce automobiles for the world market. And they might say, well, we could do that, but they're already being produced so efficiently at so low cost in the developed countries because of the high technology and the capabilities there, that if we tried to produce these products and sell them in the international markets, we get beat up by the international competition. We simply don't have the wherewithal or the way to increase productivity enough to be efficient enough to be competitive with world-class industries in the rest of the world. And that's often the argument for why developing countries will say they need protection. They need to keep out foreign products rather than letting them come freely in, because they fear that all of their industries are going to be demised because they can't live up to the expectations or the competitiveness of the developed countries' industries. All right, so what to do about it? The infant industry argument says, this is a situation where the problem is not that these countries cannot be world-class efficient, but that it takes some time in order to get to that. It takes a learning process. And the problem with not producing these particular goods for the moment is that they may never enter the learning process and may never have a chance to have these world-class competitive industries in the future. So the infant industry argument kind of takes as its analogy raising children and bringing up an infant to maturity and releasing that child out on its own to fend for itself. Now, children are unable to take care of themselves and need support in the early stages of their life. And what all parents strive to do is to raise their children up to become self-sufficient. That is, go off on the world on their own, be world-class competitive, make enough money to earn and provide for themselves, and that's the goal. But it takes some time to get there. In fact, it can take 20, it takes 25, 30 years, or more to get a child to that particular level. Well, now let's jump back to industries. Maybe we need to do kind of the same process with industries in developing countries especially. So we need to protect them and nurture them in early stages. And what that means is, okay, they can't live on their own. They can't produce world-class competitive goods. They need some help. And one way to give them help is through a very high tariff, perhaps, on imports of foreign products coming into the market. Raise up the price domestically, which we know tariffs will do, and kind of give a cushion to the developing countries' firms who are not world-class competitive yet, but will be given a chance to begin to produce, begin to experiment and explore, to learn. And that if we provide this protection to these firms for a long enough period of time, maybe 10, 15, even 20 years, that the learning process will be sustained throughout that period, and that eventually we could take away the protection and the support, or the subsidies, just like for children. And these firms, after having learned what they need to know to be world-class competitive, can go out in the world, prosper, be fruitful, and multiply, and all of that. All right, so not a bad idea. Sounds like it could work. And the way in which we can induce this particular outcome is with a tariff in the early stages. But one of the key aspects, and a couple of the key aspects of the story is, infant industry protection means putting tariffs into place for a period of time, and then removing those tariffs eventually, at some later period of time. Now, the tariffs are meant to nurture the industry and give them a chance to catch up to the world-class competitive industries in the rest of the world. And that implies a learning process. In economics, we will sometimes refer to it as learning by doing. And that distinguishes it from another process, which is kind of learning by going to school and then bringing all of that back after you've learned it at school. So, you could say, well, how could a developing country learn how to be world-class competitive in steel production? And one idea is just send a bunch of people from your country to school in other countries. Have them learn all about mechanical engineering and chemistry and all sorts of things that you might need to understand the steel process. work in a steel mill for a few years here, then bring all that knowledge back, and then just start up a steel firm and start producing. There's one way in which you might be able to transfer the skills and the knowledge needed to be world-class efficient. But most people think that won't work perfectly. That you need to kind of be in the process of producing steel for a period of time, that you have to do steel production in order to learn how to do it well. And that you learn all sorts of little things that you wouldn't learn in the book until you get that practical real-world experience. And so the learning by doing process is important for the infant industry argument to work. It's a necessary component of it, really. All right, so you put protection into place for 20 years or so. You take it off at the end of 20 years. Your firms have become world-class efficient and can go out and be competitive in the international market. Now, let's take a look at how that would be analyzed in the context of our simple or basic models. First of all, I'm going to draw a market for a particular product, quantity on one axis and price on the other axis. I'm going to draw the supply and demand curves of the world price. We're going to imagine that we have a small importing country. So the country is small. We've got a downward sloping demand curve for the product in this particular small country. We've got a world price for the good. I'm going to mark the world price off here, PW. That's going to give me DW. Let's call it DFT. Sorry, D in free trade. But the supply function in this particular case, I'm going to draw a little bit different. I'm going to draw the supply to look like this. And the key aspect of it is that supply is intersecting the price axis above the world price for this individual product. Now, what this implies is that supply, which corresponds to the marginal cost curves of the individual firms in a competitive industry, the supply function is too high in order to induce any production to take place in this particular industry if it faced the world price of PW. Costs are too high. If we just allowed free trade to prevail, consumers would want to demand DFT at the world price, suppliers would supply zero, and the country would just import the product entirely from the rest of the world. No production would take place, and as a result of no production, we could imagine that no learning is going to take place into the future. And so there's going to be no improvement in competitiveness, there's no improvement in the outcome in the future if this is the state of the world today and every day into the future. So if we think about this being today, and we imagine that we just allow the free market to function, then if we jump to the future, this is how things are going to look. Remarkably, the price in the world hasn't changed at all. We might be 20 years farther down the road, but the price for this product is the same. Remarkably, the demand curve for this product in this country hasn't changed at all. And, not remarkably, based on the story we're telling, the supply is going to stay exactly the same too. Which means no learning. 20 years from now, we still have no firms in this country producing this particular product. Developed countries thrive now producing these products. They'll thrive in the future. And the developing country is left, producing maybe agricultural goods and digging up resources from the ground and has not had a chance to kind of step into the industrializing mode that other developed countries have followed in the past. So the present and the future look the same if there's no intervention of any sort. But let's correct the problem. And let's correct the problem with protection, and infant industry protection. So now we're going to look at this industry in this small developing country, classify it as an infant, decide that it needs nurturing in the early term so that it can grow up and thrive in the future, and we're going to offer that nurturing through the form of a protective tariff. Now, a tariff today is going to do the following. It's going to raise up the price by the amount of the tariff. So the price will go from PW up to PW plus T, where T, this distance, is the value of the tariff. Let's imagine that that tariff Sorry. Raises up the price just a little bit. That lowers the demand, let's say down to D sub t, and most notably, it raises up the supply to S sub t. So tariff, we know, raises up the domestic price of the product and can induce an increase in supply. Now, what's notable here is it's induced supply to go from 0 to some positive level. And that means with a high enough protective tariff, keeping out foreign products, it's made it cost efficient to produce this product because they can sell it at a much higher price on the domestic marketplace. Now, they can't sell it internationally because the international price is way down here, so they're not going to be able to sell or export or anything like that, but they'll be able to produce for the domestic market. And by virtue of that, we're going to be hopeful that it could set off this learning process, and that learning by doing might be an outcome in the future. All right, now if we were to analyze the welfare effects of this protection in the early stages, we would have to do something like this. We put in areas A, B, C, and D. We would say, what is the change in consumer surplus? That. The change in consumer surplus as a result of putting the tariff into place. And the answer would be minus A plus B plus C plus D. If we said, what is the change in producer surplus as a result of the tariff? We would say plus A. Producers are now getting some surplus. They got none before. And the amount they're getting is area A. If we said, what is the change in government revenue as a result of the tariff? Our answer would be plus C. This is the same as we've done in the small country tariff before. And if we said, well, what is the change in national welfare or market welfare as a result of this tariff? The answer would be minus B minus D. That would be the deadweight losses that accrue because of the inefficiencies caused because we're forcing domestic production rather than importing it cheaply from abroad. But that's ignoring. That story is what would happen in the here and now. What would happen in the year in which the protection is being provided, but it's ignoring the fact that that protection might have a positive dynamic effect on the economy longer into the future. So now, let's tell that story. As a result of protecting this market in the early stages, positive production of ST takes place that wouldn't have taken place otherwise. Therefore, there's a learning effect, let's imagine, taking place. And as a result of that learning effect, the costs of producing this product within this country should fall. And that's what learning is going to mean. So costs of production, each period, they learn a little bit more, they change things around a little bit, they organize more effectively, and as they do that, the costs of producing this product begin to fall in this country. And a little bit will lower the first year, and then the second year a little bit more, and the third year more, and on and on and on. Now, in order to model that, that would mean each year the supply curve is going to start shifting down, 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 with each efficiency improvement and each innovation they introduce into their production process. Now, to do this dynamically and to think about it over multiple years is a very complicated exercise mathematically and even diagrammatically. So I'm going to kind of jump to the future and imagine, if you will, that all of these efficiency improvements take place kind of along the way and get implemented in the final year. All right, so let's just jump to the future and imagine that all this learning has taken place for maybe 20 years of protection that looks like this. We jump to the future, and what's going to happen is the supply curve, let's say, jumps down to S prime. So the lowering of the supply curve means a lowering of the average costs of production for firms in this industry, and it's that which is going to make them world-class competitive. So this shift comes about because of the learning effect, the shift in supply from S to S prime. And again, that's only going to happen if the infant industry protection was given in the first period to induce production, to induce the learning. Now, there's a second thing that should happen in the second period, or in the future, I should say. And the second thing that should happen is that the government should remove the protective tariff. Because once the industry has grown up and can produce on its own for world-class for the world market, it doesn't need any infant industry protection any longer. Now Now it can sustain production, you can see. Even if the government puts a zero tariff into place, production in this market is going to rise up to S, let's call it S2, and demand is going to stay at this DFT level. See that? Yes. So let's imagine that's exactly what does happen. Future comes, the shift in the supply curve happens immediately, and the government eliminates the protective tariff in place that it had on earlier. Now, we might ask, what is the effect in the future as a result of the infant industry protection? And here we have to be a little bit careful, because there's two ways in which we can look at the effect that's occurred in the second period. We can look at the effect here with S prime relative to what existed when the tariff was in place. But that's not what we really want to do. Instead, we want to look at what happens here in the future with the protective tariff in period 1 in place compared to what would happen in the future without the protective tariff in place. In other words, we want to compare this outcome where the price is PW, supply is S2, and demand is DFT, to the situation where the supply is at S, no production takes place in the future because there was no infant industry protection, and demand continues to be at DFT. So we ask, how are the consumers and producers of the government affected in the second period following one path versus following the other path? And the answer is really pretty simple. Consumers, for example, in the future are going to get the price PW. And they're going to get that price regardless of whether the supply curve is S or S prime. So the effect on consumers in the future is zero. There's no effect on consumers. Don't even have to write it. The effect on the government in the future. Well, the government in the future is not introducing a tariff under the first scenario, and they're not introducing a tariff in the second scenario. So there's no tariff revenue in either case. There's no government effect whatsoever. The only thing we have to worry about in the future is the change in producer surplus. And that's going to be given by this area right here, E. E is that triangle. That triangle is the producer surplus that will be generated in the industry as a result of production at S2 with this new supply curve S prime. Plus E is the producer surplus in the future. And now this gets at the gist of the story, because the story is introducing this learning effect. The learning effect can be thought of as an externality effect. But it's an odd externality. The externality effect here is an externality that it rises over time. Because the firms produced in the early stages, they learned. And because they learned, they got a better production function in the future and were able to lower their costs of producing. So the externality is an intertemporal externality. By producing more today, you're able to sustain an improved production process in the future. You get learning effects. It's an over time kind of experience. And it's external to today, and you have to take that into account if you want to incorporate all of the costs and benefits into the future. Now, it's a positive externality effect as well, because it's having a positive effect on this industry in the future. All right, so I would describe this market imperfection as a positive production externality effect. Oh, I should add one more. A positive intertemporal production externality. Got it? Positive intertemporal, over time, production externality. In a normal, perfectly competitive market model, we don't even think about time. It's a static model that takes place at one point in time, and therefore introducing this element is introducing a market imperfection. Now, when we introduce it, we can now tell something like the following story. Put the protection in place in the short term to stimulate production in the economy and generate the learning effects that you're trying to achieve. To do that has an economic cost on the economy. It's minus B and D. And you know, it's not B and D just once. It's B and D, first year, second year, third year, fourth year. It's B and D like times 20 or so. Because you got 20 years of these deadweight losses that you're going to incur in order to induce production in this particular industry. Now, we incur costs in the short term, but why are we doing it? We're doing it because of this benefit in the future. And the benefit is the producer's surplus that's going to be positive for firms in the future. You're going to create an industry that didn't exist before. And it's going to create jobs, and it's going to create the possibility for development, and it's going to possibly generate an increase in growth in your economy, and increases in standards of living, and all sorts of wonderful things can happen by stimulating the industrial process in a developing country like this. So you're going to get this producer surplus, this profitability in the future from firms that wouldn't exist otherwise. But you know what? It's not 1 year's worth of surplus. It's year 20, 21, 22, 25, 30, 35, 50. It goes on forever into the future, right? So we can take that plus E that's being created in the future, and we can multiply it by, I don't know, infinity. It's kind of an exaggeration. We probably want to do a time discounted present value of future earning and all of that, but let's not be that sophisticated. We get a lot of benefits in the future. And if these benefits, which infinity times E is definitely going to be bigger than B minus D times 20, then the benefits you're getting in the future are outweighing the cost that it takes you to incur to get there. And we could end up with a long-term improvement in welfare for the country that's imposing this particular policy. Hence, infant industry protection can be beneficial for the economy in the long term, even while it's detrimental in the short term. All right, now, there's a lot of problems with this too. So let's talk about some of the problems. Before I do that, I want to emphasize again, though, that here's a situation where we have a small country. We've expanded the problem to introduce assumptions about time and about learning effects and things like that. We've introduced this positive production intertemporal externality, and by virtue of that, we have now discovered that there is a possibility for an improvement in welfare for the country by implementing a protectionist trade policy. By putting a tariff into place in this particular case, we can raise up the national welfare of a small country. And free trade, in other words, might not be the best policy for this particular small developing country because of the infant industry story. So we might want to protect because of unemployment. We might want to protect markets because of learning effects in infant industries, and we might want to protect markets for lots of other reasons as well. What this starts to show us is that free trade really, in a more complicated world setting, is not the best policy. Not from a theoretical perspective, because we can come up with lots of examples like this where free trade is not the best policy. All right, so why do so many economists still think free trade is the best policy? It's based on a more sophisticated thinking about this and a more sophisticated argument. So let me give you a couple of problems that arise here. The first problem is really the problem of defining the externality. Because the way in which I've just described this externality, well, it's not really an externality effect. Externalities arise whenever production or consumption activities have a positive or negative effect upon people outside of the marketplace. All right, and the best example of a negative production externality is pollution that's caused by a firm that's emitting smoke and noxious gases into the atmosphere, for example. Okay, the negative effects are being borne by people who may not even be buying the product that's being produced in that firm. All right, so it's outside of the industry. Now here, I described an externality effect, but it was an intertemporal externality, and the positive effects that are going to be generated are actually going to be generated within the firms themselves. It's not external to the market, it's just external to this period of time in the marketplace. So the problem is an intertemporal one for sure, but it's not really an externality, we could say. So how could we correct for this without government intervention? Well, the answer to that is loans. Borrowing and lending is a way to correct for the intertemporal problem that's prevailing here. What do I mean? Well, let's suppose we have a country and we have the prospects that if we develop an industry in this particular country, that it can become world-class competitive, but it's going to take 20 years to get there because of all the learning effects and so forth. But the conditions are right. Comparative advantages are there. We can, let's say, project into the future, and we could really produce, automobiles or steel or biotechnology products in this country really, really well. But we need to finance the startup of it. So, you go to somebody in the rest of the world, a banking organization, and you say, look, if you could just loan us $2 to $4 billion, right? Then we're going to pay all these workers, we're going to lose a bunch of money. But 20 years from now, we're going to make a boatload of money, and we're going to be able to pay back all your loans with interest, and you're going to be better off, we're going to be better off, everyone wins. That's the way to correct for this kind of intertemporal problem. All right, well, is there a problem with that? The way I set it up, you may have opened your eyes a little bit when I said, let's just borrow $2 to $4 billion. Who's going to lend somebody that much money for a 20-year payoff? Well, it's kind of hard to think about that. Maybe nobody's going to be willing to do that. But, think about all of the companies that, the capital markets, for example. And all the individuals who invest in these little startup companies, and they throw money into it, and there's no revenue coming in the early stages. And why are companies and people willing to throw money at these new ventures? Because there's this prospect that they're going to make a bunch of money in the future. Right? Well, if it works in high-tech industries, why can't it work in developing countries where you can lend a bunch of money to certain industries, develop them, and have them turn out to be world-class competitive in the future? In fact, maybe you only have like an organization, like a bank, which was funded by a lot of different countries to help developing countries kind of build up certain projects. And if they would be willing to lend like lots and lots and lots of money to these individual, anybody know of an organization that does something like that around here, down the street? Yeah, the World Bank does something like that, right? They're an organization that can help fund large infrastructure projects, development projects like this, yeah, maybe even billions of dollars that can flow to a particular country to help finance the development of an industry so that the economy can grow faster and can sustain itself in the future. So if that's the issue, then the problem really isn't one that ought to be corrected with a trade tariff. Instead, we ought to build up institutions that can lend money to developing countries and solve the intertemporal problems by having experts research where the best projects are, lend them money appropriately, have them build up these industries, help generate growth in those countries, and all the developing countries will grow up very rapidly and will become world-class competitive and developed eventually. Now, that's the idea, if you will, behind the World Bank and other international lending institutions like that. So if we accept that, then throw away the protective tariff. It's a worse policy to try to implement this. There's better policies by using the banking system. But there's some other ways in which we can tell this story, too. And maybe even then, the lending might not work most effectively, and maybe you'd want to think about some other intervention. So the way in which we turn this into a true externality problem is to argue that, maybe the bank, maybe the industry can't borrow enough money from the private banking sector. But maybe if you can convince governments that if you can build up the steel sector or the auto sector or the high-tech sector in this country, that it's not going to just benefit that industry, but that it's going to have spillover effects to other industries within the community or within the country itself. That maybe what you're financing is not just how to produce better steel, but how to better organize your production facilities, how to develop your organizational structure in an appropriate way, how to get your workers to show up on time and to be more productive and things like that. That if you can do that in one industry, the workers who learn those skills in that industry are some are going to have arguments with their boss, they're going to quit, and they're going to go and they're going to start up another firm, or they're going to move to some other sector somewhere else in the economy. And these learning effects can start to spread out across the economy into other industries. And if that's the case, that that's where a good chunk of the positive returns to the economy are going to come from, then simple borrowing from the bank by an industry is not going to solve that particular problem. And you need public institutions to kind of recognize those particular effects and be willing to lend money or protect certain markets in order to achieve those spillover effects in the rest of the economy. So you might need a World Bank, or you might need government involvement in order to kind of overcome that externality problem that I've just described in that particular way. All right, but there's some other issues that we can point to with this particular example as well. Another issue goes back to the same issue we raised with respect to unemployment in the import market in the previous example. We said that tariff could raise national welfare when there's a surge of imports and unemployment is caused because of it. But we then said that there was a better policy that could be used instead, and that better policy was a production subsidy in that case. Well, it turns out that the same answer applies to this particular case as well. If we say, let's consider a tariff, a protective tariff, infant industry protection, and we compared it to infant industry subsidization with a production subsidy, and we compared those two policies to try to achieve the result that I'm displaying on this graph here, it would turn out that the production subsidy is cheaper to implement than the trade tariff. The production subsidy stimulates production by the domestic firms, can get them started, can get them learning at a much lower cost to the economy than an import tariff can do. So it turns out that even if you accept the infant industry argument as 100% valid and true, trade policy is not the best option to pursue to correct for that particular problem. A domestic policy is better instead. And that's where a lot of trade economists come down. They would say, yeah, we could use protective tariffs, but it's not the best way to go. We ought to think about how to correct for these market problems by using purely domestic policies instead, because 9 times out of 10, that's going to be the very best way to solve this particular problem. And that becomes one of the strong rationales for economists for accepting that free trade still remains the best course of action, because there's better ways to correct for these individual problems at home rather than using trade as a tool instead. Trade policy, tariffs, cause too many distortions, causes losses to consumers that will generally outweigh the benefits that will accrue and generates a more costly outcome for the economy. So, in the terminology I introduced last week, trade policy is the second best policy in the infant industry case. A first best policy would be a production subsidy instead. Or use capital markets, borrowing and lending, banking institutions, the World Bank, as a way of lending money to individual productive firms in certain countries to try to stimulate their growth and development to generate the positive spillover effects that we're describing in this particular story. There are better ways to solve the problem than infant industry protection. Now, there are some problems that arise. And the way I've just told this story, I tell this story all the time, and I talk about the World Bank and what their mission is, and how it just seems like it's such a simple process. We just lend money to people. They build up these new industries. It grows their economies. They all thrive. Everybody becomes richer. And yet, when we look at the world in the last 50 years, we have had this process where lots of large institutions have lent money to developing countries. They've implemented all sorts of projects, and many of the countries have not grown very rapidly at all. And now they're stuck with lots of debt that they have to repay to the country that they borrow the money from, and it just hasn't worked very well. So we might ask, well, why doesn't it work? Now, we have enough knowledge about where the best industries are and what the best support should be, and the answer to that is maybe no. It's very hard to have good information about the future. and to know exactly what industries you ought to be producing. So let's look at this infant industry argument a little bit more carefully and think hard about the information requirements to make this work effectively. Okay, so the first thing we might focus our attention on is a recognition of the fact that this learning by doing effect, what we're really trying to do is project for a particular country and economy kind of what they will have a comparative advantage in, not now, but 20 years from now. And that should be taking into account all of the changes, kind of all of the internal resources that we know are available in this country right now. It's taking into account what the human capital, the skill level of the workforce will be, not now, but 20 years from now. And it's also taking into account, or you should, all of the technological innovations that are going to take place in other parts of the world to know whether country X is indeed going to have a comparative advantage in this product 20 years from now or not. Well, knowing all about the technological changes that might influence, say, the steel sector, and knowing what the skill level of your workforce will be 20 years from now, or what your resource base will be, some of those we could answer pretty definitively maybe, but some of them, there's going to be an awful lot of uncertainty associated with it. And it may well be that some of the industries in question, there's lots of industries you can support. So it's probably true that country X will have a comparative advantage in 5 or 10 or 20 different items in 20 years, but not in everything. And you've got to be able to distinguish the things which the country will have a comparative advantage in from the things they will not have a comparative advantage in. Because let's suppose that you put protection into place, or a production subsidy, whatever, or make loans, because you're the World Bank, and you put them into an industry that has no chance of having a comparative advantage in that particular product 20 years from now. What that means is that you're going to pour resources into this industry to get them to produce today, but when you arrive in the future 20 years from now, they're not going to be any more productive or more competitive relative to the rest of the world than they are right now. And that means you will have wasted protection or support for a particular industry and not gotten any payoff for it in the future. So one of the big issues you have to face is how do you distinguish between the good industries, the right ones to subsidize and support, from the not so good industries, the ones which you will not have a chance of having a comparative advantage in the future. And it's really hard to distinguish those and to know what the future will bring. I mean, we live in a very dynamic and incredibly fast-changing world. Technology is changing constantly, and it's very difficult for us to predict 3 or 4 years in the future, let alone 20 years into the future, to make some of these things work. So that's problem number one. How do we identify the right industries? Not easy to do. And if we subsidize the wrong industries or protect the wrong industries, then we're not going to get the positive payoff, and the protection is not going to be beneficial for the country in the long run. All right, now here's another approach we could do. We could solve that problem a little bit by saying, let's suppose we protect all of the industries. Okay, you may have heard the term import substitution policies. In Latin American countries and some African countries and a few others around the world, like India, after World War II, implemented what came to be known as import substitution policies. And these policies were designed on the basis of this infant industry argument, generally. But what it said is that basically we're going to spur domestic production by keeping out foreign products entirely. So we're going to put up a high tariff wall on lots of different items. And by putting those high tariffs into place, we're going to force production at home. Then we're going to learn how to produce these items more effectively. We're going to be able to become world-class competitive because we will force production of not 1 or 2 or 3 things, but a whole range of items across the spectrum. So just put a high barrier or wall of protection in place across the board in order to stimulate domestic production. Import substitution, that's what the idea is. Now, you don't have to pick winners. You just have to protect everybody. Well, here's the problem with that outcome. The problem is that probably the underlying situation is that some of the industries are going to work well in the future and some of them are not. So if you do a blanket protection you may produce 5 or 10 winners that 20 years from now turn out to be world-class competitive, you have a comparative advantage in, everything works great. But you may produce hundreds of losers at the same time. Industries that don't learn, don't become world-class competitive, just can't catch up to the rest of the world. And while you may be able to lower your barriers of protection for some industries, you're likely to have to keep them on for all of these other industries who are going to say they're going to die a rapid death if you remove the protection at some point in the future. So when you evaluate an import substitution policy, you can't do a case study kind of approach. You can't say, let's just look at and note that, hey, shipbuilding industry in Korea, they became fantastic, world-class competitors producing the best ships in the world, and they did it through industrial policy. They did it because the government stepped in and said, we're going to protect and market this industry, we're going to give them resources, subsidies, they're going to become world, and they did. They became world-class efficient. So you say, see, it works. Here's the problem. You can't just look at one industry isolated in a particular country and say it worked, because you have to look at what Korea did with every industry. And whether their support to all of the industries in total was a winner economically or not. You've got to look at the full range of policies and not just one individual policy in order to make an evaluation of whether it can work or not on a larger scale. Or else, you've got to be able to say, I can pick the winners. I know which industries are going to do best 20 years from now, and that's a really difficult thing to do. Okay, so these are some of the issues that rise. There's some other issues. These issues just go on and on. Another issue to be concerned about is the problem of lobbying. Let's say the government says, hey, we're going to do an industrial strategy. We're going to promote certain industries that have a good chance of being world-class competitive in the future. And we're going to take nominations. So which of you, all of you are a different industry, which of you think you're going to be world-class competitive and deserve government subsidies and support right now? All of you should raise your hand. Everyone does, right? I'll make a case for why the toothpick industry is a winner in the future. And we deserve billions of dollars of support from the government because, we can make the best toothpicks in the world and we can beat out everybody if only we had a little bit of support up front. So there's a problem with sort of if you set up a system where you're going to subsidize certain industries and not others, you're going to pick certain winners, the process of selecting them is going to be one where you've got to gather information, and you're going to gather information from people who have a particular self-interest that they're trying to promote and are likely to skew the information in their particular favor. So you've got to be able to, and that's why you're here, to learn as much as you can about as many things so you can learn how to discern what is good information from bad information. There's a lot of information, and a lot of information is bad information. You've got to be able to figure out how to do that. Now, oftentimes, when we say these policies can work, we just kind of assume the government is knowledgeable, and they're going to be able to figure out which are the best industries to promote. But they're not perfect, and they've got to gather information often from the industries themselves in order to figure out which of the industries to support in the first place. And that's a very difficult process. That may be impossible to answer. And so you may end up supporting not the firms most likely to be efficient in the future, but you might instead end up supporting the firms that happen to have certain individuals who are well connected and have certain amounts of money that can support the lobbying process that got them the money to be transferred over, and so forth and so on. That could be a problem, because then you may not be picking the right industries in order to promote. Here's another problem that arises in particular with this long-term infant industry argument. You put protection into place and you tell the firm, we're going to protect you for 20 years. You're going to grow up, you're going to learn all these things, and in the future we're going to take the protection away and you're going to fend for yourselves. So, first couple of years, what does the firm do? They set off trying to learn as much as they can and become world-class efficient? No, they might just say, we don't really have to do much because we've got a high protective wall, a tariff in place, we can produce at a high price, we can sell at a high price, we've got a cornered market, there's no competition, so let's just sit back and take it easy. So they sit back and take it easy, and because of the high protective tariff, you haven't induced the innovation that you're trying and the learning that you're trying to induce in this industry. So now 10 years go by, 15 years go by, and suddenly the industry starts to go, oh my gosh, our protective tariff is going to be eliminated in 5 years. What do we do? Now, you got 5 years to go. You've done nothing in the past 15 years. You're still just as productive as you were at year 1. Now, you've got 2 options. You either work like crazy to learn as much as you can to become world-class competitive, or you send a bunch of people to go have lunch with government officials, telling them about why 20 years is really not enough for your industry. How really you need 25 years of protection, or maybe 30 years, because it's going to take a lot longer and because conditions have changed and whatnot. Now, it's going to be easier and maybe even less costly to lobby your government officials for continuing protection rather than trying to come up to speed and become world-class efficient or competitive. And so there's a perverse incentive there that may actually not induce learning, it may not induce innovation, but may actually induce laziness for a long period of time, followed by subsequent lobbying to try to promote an outcome that allows the laziness to continue. This is not fabrication. This is not just speculation, because this is exactly what has happened in many countries that have protected their markets for long periods of time. Yeah.
Can you give examples?
Brazil. Brazil is a good example of a country that has given lots of benefits to its industries back in the 80s and 90s, and basically employing the infant industry argument and just sort of continuing to give subsidies to individual firms. I teach a group of Brazilians all the time. Whenever I do the infant industry argument, they immediately bring up their computer industry in Brazil. Because in Brazil, back in the early 90s, they said, we're not going to, Apples and Microsoft, IBMs, no, we don't need that. We're going to produce our own computers. So they closed off their markets in order to produce their own computers, and their computers got nothing but worse and worse and worse over time. Eventually, they stopped it, and they opened up the market, and they can buy foreign computers today. But it was an example of where they tried to support a particular industry in order to become world-class competitive, and it just didn't work in the end. And there's lots of examples like that in the world. And there are lots of examples where it did work. And so you got to be a little bit careful in looking at the evidence. I'll bet I could come up with 10, 20, 30 examples where you could say government got involved, it had this great positive outcome in that particular industry. The trick is, how do you know, going forward in a particular country, which of those is the right industries to support and which one's not? So I'm going to stop with all of this because there's a lot I've just thrown at you. But the basic gist of this story is, in order to make these policies work, you need a lot of information. It's got to be good, reliable information, objective information, and it's often information about the future, which is very difficult to know or to obtain. And that makes a lot of these policies very, very difficult to implement effectively, and there's lots of examples where it has not worked very well in the aggregate. Yes?
Is this something that the United States actively tries to do as well in certain industries?
We do it sometimes. So we have intervened when necessary or seemingly necessary to help our auto industry, for example, from time to time, as we did at the start of the financial crisis. And any time something starts to go wrong, our industries will come and say, hey, this is really important. It's creating a lot of jobs in America. We can be better if only we get some temporary protection and support. And sometimes that has worked, and sometimes it has not worked as well. We tend to intervene after the fact, not so much as a concentrated or directed policy towards the future. And in that respect, the U.S. has tended to be a little bit more open, less prone to using the so-called industrial policies to try to promote certain sectors of the economy than have other countries around the world. Okay, now, how much time have I got? Any? Yes, lots of time. So there's a problem with information, and that's another reason why oftentimes economists will argue that it may not be prudent or appropriate to implement protection, even in small country cases, and even in times when you could make an argument for why protection might be beneficial. The hesitation on the part of economists often comes because of the recognition of how very difficult it seems to be to identify the appropriate sources of support, the appropriate industries to support, and to set the incentives correctly so that you're actually inducing the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And we've got lots and lots of examples where that has not worked very effectively. And in fact, you can read long books about the World Bank and its ineffectiveness through the years, and a lot of it focuses on just those kind of issues. How do they gather information and use it effectively, not have the money kind of taken and stolen and used for other purposes than what it's intended? And the World Bank has spent billions upon billions, tens of billions of dollars over the years, and in some reviewers' respects, has not gotten a very good outcome for the countries which they're trying to help in a lot of ways. And they face all of the problems that I just suggested about this. This issue is something that the World Bank faces in a lot of its projects as well. So it's very, very hard to make that happen and make it work effectively. Now, there's the next thing that I want to talk just a little bit about, very briefly, is I've said that trade policy is a second best policy in most instances, and domestic policies are a first best policy in most instances. I throw in that in most instances part. So it may make sense for me to tell you a few instances where trade policy is probably the first best policy and the most appropriate way to intervene in certain circumstances. All right, so as we look through all of these different policies and imperfections that might be incorporated into markets, like I said, in almost all cases, we find that it would be better to correct for these problems, if you can, with a domestic policy than a trade policy. Here are the two exceptions that can arise on the other side. Number one, you've already seen it before. When a country is large in international markets, you can put a tariff into place and you can raise up national welfare for the country. The optimal tariff in a large country case is a positive tariff. Now, the reason a large country can raise its national welfare is because largeness is an imperfection. Largeness is not a perfectly competitive market, and let me explain why. In perfect competition on the production side, the assumption implies that there are many, many, many firms, right, that each of which are too small to affect the price of the market. Therefore, they take the price that's given and make their decisions accordingly. So perfect competition involves lots and lots of firms, all of which are too small to influence the price. Each of which are too small to influence the price. In an international marketplace, largeness of a country means that by putting a tariff or a policy in place that affects trade, it can have an influence upon the price in the rest of the world. Policy change can have an influence upon the world price. That's what bigness means, that's what largeness is, and that's also what is counter to the assumption of perfect competition. Now, the world, if we wanted the world to be perfectly competitive in all respects, then the appropriate unit of government should be really, really small. Each country, if you will, should be the size of, I don't know, Monaco. Right? It should have 35,000 people or 100,000 people, and that should be it. So that anything that that one country does, in terms of its policies with respect to the big world outside, will have no real impact or effect upon what happens in the world. That's what a small country assumption would mean. Small countries can't influence the prices because they're too small to have any effect. Now, when we bring countries together and make them big economic players, like the United States is, or like the European Union is, then their policies at the border can actually influence the prices in the international market, and that's kind of like having monopoly or monopsony power. Now, I don't know if I used this description when I talked about tariffs before, but let me introduce it now or reintroduce it to you, because it is in the reading. The alternative term that we use to describe a large importing country is to say they have monopsony power in trade. So I say they have monopsony power in trade. And that monopsony is a single buyer of a product in a marketplace. Now, one country operating the market is not a single buyer, but it's a big enough buyer to have influence in the market. That's why we call it monopsony power, not a monopsony itself. It has the ability to control the price. And what a monopsony does to better itself is that he or she will reduce demand in the marketplace and force a lowering of the price at which it buys the product. And that's exactly what you do when you put an import tariff into place by a large country. So a country putting an import tariff into place is going to lower the price in the international market, buy up some of it still, but if it does it just to the right degree, setting the optimal tariff, for example, it's going to raise up its own national welfare or improve itself by doing so. Now that's taking advantage of an imperfection in the market. It's taking advantage of having monopsony power. And on the export side, by the way, you could do that with an export tax or with export policy when you have monopoly power in trade. You restrict your output to the market, you raise up the price, and you shift profits in your direction as a country. Countries can do that on the export side if they're large as well. So really what a country is doing is it's exploiting its monopsony power when it puts a tariff into place as a large country. Now, we could analyze domestic policies and see whether they could have similar effects upon the welfare of a country when a country is large in international markets, and we've done that. And if we do that exercise, we can find that, for example, a production subsidy can raise welfare for a large importing country. Consumption tax domestically can raise welfare for a large importing country. But here's the thing. Those policies cannot raise welfare as much as a tariff can. The tariff is the first best policy in that circumstance when you're a large importing country. The optimal tariff is the best policy. Domestic policies can work, but they're not going to work to the same degree or the same effectiveness as an import tariff can work. So in that instance, we would say trade policy is first best, domestic policy is second best. And that's the opposite of what we said in the unemployment case and in the infant industry case. All right, but here, we could step back one step further and review one other thing we talked about with respect to tariffs. It's true that a large country can raise its welfare with an optimal tariff. But we also analyzed the case and addressed the issue of what if there are multiple large countries in the world, as there are, certainly. And what would happen if we put protective tariffs in place and other countries followed suit and they put protective tariffs in place as well, other large countries? What would happen to our national welfare relative to free trade? Remember? It's likely to go down. We're going to make ourselves worse off in the end if all of the large countries try to pursue their monopsony power. We're actually going to make ourselves worse off as a result. So we can argue that trade policy is the first best intervention in that particular case, but we also have a counter argument for why, even when that's true, large countries might best follow a free trade strategy. Because other large countries doing the same thing, getting into tariff wars with big countries, trying to beat each other out, is only going to lead to the detriment of all of the countries involved. If that's true, better to step back and have a free trade policy as well. So, we have an argument for trade being a first best policy, but also a counter argument for why we might want to have free trade even in that instance as well. There's another situation where trade policy is first best. And here, there's a reading in the chapter on market imperfections that I didn't ask you to read, but I'm just going to allude to it really briefly. One of the standard arguments in support of intervention in trade sometimes is the national security or the national defense argument. That we need to protect certain industries or basically certain industries because it's in our national interest to do so. We can certainly argue that Support domestic production and support of military industries is important. We wouldn't want to rely on others for our military needs, so we need to produce those at home. But we can also argue that we need to produce a certain minimum amount of food in order to supply our people with food in the case of a national emergency or a crisis, war. We don't want to be dependent on other people in the rest of the world for our sustenance. And we can apply that to lots of different things. We might want to protect our markets in order to have an adequate supply of those individual products in the case of a national emergency. We talked a little bit about the Jones Act way back when we were talking about services trade. And the Jones Act is an act that was implemented initially to try to make sure that we had a large enough domestic merchant fleet, shipping fleet, that in the event of war, the government could step in and requisition private ships for use for military transport. We protect the domestic shipping market entirely because we have a motivation to secure the national defense or for national security reasons. Now, public goods are a legitimate situation where government intervention can be called for, because public goods are not generally provided for adequately by a private market. There's other theories in economics that you can learn about that would demonstrate that public goods having the features of non-excludability and non-rivalry, again, don't worry about this, but public goods are not likely to be best provided for by a private market. So government can step in and actually supply a greater amount, a more appropriate amount of defense and security for a country than we might be able to achieve without government intervention. Okay, so with that said, here's the story about why a trade policy can be best for a country. And I think in a particular example of a product that we would not wish to be exported to our enemies, enemy countries. Classic example of that for the United States today is centrifuges used in the development of nuclear arms or energy or weapons by other countries. And the target country we might point to is North Korea. We have bans in place that do not allow certain types of materials and machinery to be sold to certain countries around the world, and the justification we use for that is national security or national defense. We want to keep out of the hands of our enemies or potential enemies certain items that might be used against us. Now, that is a trade policy, and it is impossible to think of any kind of domestic policy that would correct for the problem you're trying to address any more directly. So a ban on exports with high penalties for anybody found in violation of those particular policies is what we do to try to keep things under control and to prevent the exports of sensitive materials, again, for national security reasons. So we're doing that to help promote the national security, and that can be and is, I think, a perfectly justifiable use of a trade policy, export ban, in order to correct for a market imperfection, certain type of a public good that's trying to be provided for. And there's no better policy that can be thought of to be implemented instead of that one. All right, so that's a good legitimate argument for protection of a certain product, a ban on exports, to prevent certain things from happening. But there aren't too many others like that. And in most of the other situations where we have market imperfections in place, we can usually show that trade is a second best policy, not a first best policy. So the best argument we have for free trade is really that it's kind of the best we've got going out there. And that for all of the problems that people raise to say we should protect, we should raise up our barriers, we should do something to help our country, normally the trade response is an overreaction or a misdirected reaction at the wrong problem. And so what economic analysis tries to do in trade is to try to focus attention on the heart of the problem and to think that the way to intervene is more direct intervention at the imperfections themselves rather than through trade itself. And unfortunately, it often looks like trade is it's an easier to understand thing and it's easier for people to accept politically And it's easier for people to think that the blame for our problems is really what's happening from abroad, and that we need to correct it by keeping out products from abroad, rather than try to correct it internally at home, which is what economic analysis suggests would be a better or more appropriate policy. Okay, thoughts or questions? Yes.
So, if the evidence is so like overwhelming and there's such a consensus in the like expert community, should those of us that may be concerned about the upcoming administration, like, should we not be worried? Because how, like, why would the government, like, it's a huge bureaucracy, get behind a policy that's going to be, that is so obviously detrimental?
See, when it's detrimental in the large sense, when we do it on the graphs and we look at the kind of broad picture and we say this is the overall effect of these and that's why it's wrong or bad, you have to have some faith in the models. You have to have some faith in the economic analysis that's being done. And there's a lot of people who have that faith around town. But you have to also recognize that what many of our models have been showing is that certain trade policy actions like tariffs are going to help certain groups in a very concentrated way. Now those groups are the ones who have been voicing their opinions strongly and have been able to encourage kind of a popular support and a political support for what may be detrimental policies in the large sense. So yes, we have reason to be worried. And I'm not confident the system is going to automatically correct it. But we do need lots of people who recognize the broader benefits of freer trade, I think. But also recognize that it's not as simple as, when I read people talk about free trade or not, it often boils down to what seems like too simplistic an argument. And it's almost like I feel like people have a sense that economists say free trade is the best policy always. It's always good for everybody. And it's like, well, that's not true at all. We don't say that. We shouldn't say that. In our classes, I don't say that. None of my colleagues ever say that. But it's interesting that that's the impression that so many people have about what economists say when it's not really what economists say. And I attribute that largely to kind of the political economy argument in the background, that there are groups that don't really want to hear that message in some sense. They want to hear the message that trade is bad, and that's what they focus their attention on. Or there's groups that say, we want to think that trade is good, so we're going to have to sell it. We're going to have to make everybody believe that it's good for everybody. And so they sort of misrepresent what the theory tells us in order to foster their own political or ideological perspective. And that leads to a lot of misinformation that's out there and a lot of difficulty in understanding what the heck is going on. And that's a problem. So I wish I had a better solution to that, except my only solution is to keep spreading the word to groups of people like you who come and listen. I know only because you have to get 3 credits and get it on your transcript. But maybe it'll have a bigger effect in the future as you go out, multiply, tell your friends all about what you learned in this class. And yeah, do that more now than ever before, all right? Might be a good time. Spread the word.